Well, again, welcome to our midweek Bible study. I hope you're enjoying this journey through the Gospel of Mark. And on Sunday, we looked at the great confession that Peter made in Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 30, where Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "You're the Messiah." From the heights of that statement, now to the depths of missing it. Turn in your copy of Scripture to Mark chapter 8. Let's look at verses 31 through 33. And Jesus has declared and affirmed that he is the Messiah, but then he throws a wrench in the disciples' minds. He blows their minds because their idea of who the Messiah is and God's idea of who the Messiah is are totally different. All right? So begin verse 31, and this is in the context of the passion of Christ, the narrative of Christ's passion. This is the first prediction. In a couple of weeks, we're going to look at the second prediction of Jesus' death, suffering, resurrection. All right, begin verse 31. And Jesus began to teach, and you can underline began to teach because, again, we'll see how that's important. Mark does a great job just connecting different words and phrases to each other to show us a comparison between certain things. So Jesus began to teach. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man, this title, Son of Man, is the title that Jesus most often uses of himself. It is a picture of the Son of Man in Daniel's prophecies. In Daniel chapter 7, this is the Son of Man is the portrait of the Messiah, God's anointed one who has come to set everything right. All right, so so they were all down with learning about the Son of Man. Jesus is the Messiah, but Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man was different than what they imagined. All right, so he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, that the Son of Man must be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, that the Son of Man must be killed, and after 3 days the Son of Man must rise again. And he spoke this word plainly or openly, publicly. He wasn't hiding that prediction that he, as Messiah, had come to die. This was his mission, that he must suffer many things, be rejected by elders, chief priests, scribes, be killed, and then rise again. He spoke the word openly. And then Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. Underline that word, that phrase, began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan." We've used this. In fact, it's kind of a popular culture. "Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but you are mindful of the things of men." So as we look at this passage, what Jesus does, and again, we've turned the corner in Mark's gospel. From Jesus' miracle worker, although he'll still do miracles, now we've turned the corner. Jesus is making his way to the cross. And we have this extended passion narrative in Mark's gospel beginning in chapter 8, verse 31 specifically. And what Jesus does is he tells us his mission, the mission of the Messiah. Mark's gospel is going to teach us from this point forward. Jesus is going to teach us through Mark's pen that he is a Messiah, but that Messiah that God has planned doesn't fit the messianic stereotype. In fact, Jesus defines his mission in a scandalous contrast to the stereotype that the Jewish person, including the disciples, had of the Messiah. You see, the Messiah in the vision of the first century Jewish person was a vision of conquering and ruling. It's a vision of someone who's overthrowing Rome and inaugurating God's powerful kingdom in present reality, a theocracy unlike any other ever known. The Messiah is the reigning king that's better than David or as good as David. It was so earthbound, the Messiah. But Jesus is the Messiah who has come to suffer. Jesus defines the mission of the Messiah, his mission, as suffering. As you look at this passage, you see that this mission of suffering means that Jesus came to suffer many things, and many things could be that Jesus came to suffer a lot. That could refer to many things. It's a word in the Greek that can point to quantity, or it could point to quality, or so much, or quantity, a lot of stuff. So Jesus came to suffer, and his suffering includes a lot and a lot of stuff. It's big and it's expansive. He's the one who came and he performed miracles, but he's also the one who is compelled by God's divine initiative to suffer and die. His death is explicitly part of God's plan. Jesus doesn't teach, he didn't begin to teach that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected, be killed, and rise again, as though that were a surprise to him. That was his mission. He came to suffer many things, and that suffering included being rejected. Rather than the great political hero which Peter and the other disciples and Jewish people had depicted as the rule of the Messiah, Jesus shows that the three main power brokers of Israel, the elders, the scribes, and the Pharisees, were going to reject him. And they were going to destroy him. The elders being Sanhedrin, Pharisees probably the priests, those who are responsible for temple worship, and the scribes, the lawyers who make sure everybody follows the law. So Jesus said, these three power brokers are going to reject me. The Son of Man, the Messiah, is not going to be hailed as a hero. He is going to be rejected by the political and religious leaders of Israel. This is disheartening to the disciples when they hear it, because they believe that Jesus is the one who will eventually be accepted by the power brokers and become the ruler over the power brokers of Israel and even Rome. Using those three power brokers, Jesus is teaching that his rejection will be complete. It will be full. They're going to stiff-arm the Messiah. His suffering includes his rejection. His suffering means that he's going to die. And again, this is something that is incomprehensible to the first century Jewish mind in their thinking of the Messiah. They had formed their idea of the Messiah from the promise passages in the Old Testament that tell us and teach us that Jesus is the Messiah, and if he's the Messiah, he's going to bring about a whole new thing. And they interpreted the new things as earthbound, politically defined realities. And now Jesus says, no, that's not the way it's going to be. I'm going to be killed. Yes, I'm the Messiah, but the Messiah is going to die. God's initiative moved Jesus, the Messiah, on a mission toward the cross. In a couple of weeks, we're going to look at the second prediction. We're going to see, why did Jesus have to die? We'll spell it out very specifically. Ultimately, we know, as followers of Jesus, Jesus had to die because of our sin, that he was killed for our transgressions. And that was necessary for God's plan of rescue and kingdom bringing to happen. So Jesus came to be killed. His suffering included rejection and death, but it wasn't going to end in defeat, but rather the cross was the doorway to ultimate victory in the resurrection, and he would be raised from the dead in 3 days. The rejection and death of Jesus seemed to be the great cosmic defeat of the promises of God in the minds of the Jewish hearer. But the Messiah's mission traveled through the road of suffering and death toward the victory of the resurrection. Thus, his death on the cross is not defeat, as Jews and Romans alike would assume, but it's a prerequisite for the accomplishment of his mission, bringing salvation and rescue to sinners like you and me, and making us fit for God's family so that we can live each day in the hope that God offers through Jesus Christ. Well, all of this teaching, Jesus began to teach in the prediction that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, the priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day rise again. That teaching flew in the face of the disciples. Peter, again, is the spokesperson, and Peter says, oh, we can't have this talk anymore. Again, look at the text. It says that in verse 32, Jesus spoke this word openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Now, Peter was disappointed. Again, the most common conception of the Messiah in a pre-Christian world, according to the pre-Christian sources, is that of an eschatological king. Although Peter had made this great confession that Jesus is the Christ, he didn't like the definition that Jesus gave to that title. So, where Jesus began to teach that the Son of Man must suffer many things, now Peter began to rebuke Jesus. Jesus began to teach, this is who the Messiah is. This is the mission of the Messiah. Peter began to rebuke Jesus. You've got it all wrong. Don't talk like this. It's a scolding. So when Jesus began to teach on the Messiah's mission of suffering, Peter began to rebuke Jesus for his teaching. And rebuke, in Mark's gospel especially, is the prerogative of God alone and his Messiah. Rebuke on the lips of Jesus made demons flee in chapter 1, verse 25, chapter 9, verse 25. Rebuke on the lips of Jesus made the storm stop and be still, Mark 4:39. But rebuke on the lips of Peter toward Jesus as a scolding correction of the Messiah, the King of glory, was simply disrespect. Disappointment. And disappointment, even in our heroes, can lead to a disrespect. Now, what is the lesson we can learn from this? Well, obviously, we need to understand who Jesus is. Jesus came on a mission, and that mission was not to make you rich. That mission was not to make you happy. That mission was to make you fit, holy, for God's family. That mission included suffering, demanded suffering. Either his or ours. And God in his love sent Jesus to suffer on our behalf so that we, through faith in him, might be fit for God's family. We need to understand who Jesus is. If we're going to follow him, we need to understand who he is. But if we lean into Peter, here's again something that I think is very applicable to us. Peter was a disciple of Jesus, said great things about Jesus, would eventually be one of the greatest ambassadors for Jesus in the world. But here, Peter, because of his disappointment, begins to scold the King of glory. And that's not what it means to follow Jesus. You see, following Jesus, discipleship, following Jesus means that we follow Jesus on God's terms, not making Jesus into the creation we want him to be, but rather submitting to who he is. And this was a lesson that Peter would eventually learn and the disciples would eventually learn, but it begins here. Peter is scolding Jesus. Jesus turns around, almost like he's ignoring Peter. It says he turns around and he faces the disciples. And Jesus faces the disciples, and almost without looking at Peter, he begins to rebuke Peter. Remember, Peter took Jesus aside to rebuke him. He said, I'm not going to do this in front of the others, but you need to know what you're doing is wrong. And Jesus turns away from Peter, turns toward the disciples, and perhaps without even looking at Peter, begins to rebuke him, like he rebuked the demons, like he rebuked the waves and the storm. And Jesus rebuked. And again, listen to what he said. He said, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, Satan there could be a description of Satan himself, a reference. And I believe that there is a reference to Jesus, like Jesus in the wilderness when he's being tempted. And he said, "Get behind me, Satan," or "Be gone, Satan." Satan is the adversary to God's purpose and plan. So he could be calling Peter Satan. But Satan in the Greek also means accuser or opposer. O-P-P-O-Z-E-O-S-E-R, opposer. And so it could be that he's saying, "Get behind me, you who oppose me." Either way, the point is still the same. It's a rebuke, and it is a down-dressing of Peter. And then he goes on, he says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not mindful. Your head is not on straight. You're thinking not of the things of God. You're thinking about the things of men." So as a follower of Jesus who gets disappointed at times by how things are working out, get disappointed. I'm trying to be faithful, God, but you're just not doing your part. You ever been there? How do we continue following faithfully? Well, the first thing, if we learn from Peter, is if we're going to follow faithfully, in line with the mission of the Messiah, who came to suffer many things, to be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, to be killed, and to be raised from the dead on 3 days, after 3 days. If we're going to get in line with that, if we're going to follow Jesus and as he walks his mission, then we must first reorient our living in line with following him. We've got to reorient how we live so that it fits following Jesus. Not getting ahead of him, but following. See, Peter was trying to get ahead of Jesus. Peter was trying to coach up Jesus. That's what the rebuke was. Have you tried to coach up Jesus? Have you tried to get ahead of him? Say, "Jesus, I'm going to do it this way, and I need for you to get in line and bless what I'm doing." Now, that's not following Jesus. Following Jesus is hearing what Jesus says. Get behind me. Get behind me. The Greek phrase, hupago opiso mu. It's a command, and it means get in line behind me. Get in line behind me. Now, Peter was serving as a stumbling block to the fulfillment of the mission. His rebuke was a stumbling block. Jesus, you don't need to do it this way. You need to do it our way. And again, it's reminiscent of what the devil did in the wilderness, tempting Jesus, trying to get Jesus to get off mission and do good stuff a different way. That's what Peter was doing. And so Jesus said to Peter, "You need to get in line and follow me. I know where I'm going. I know what I'm doing. And what I'm doing and where I'm going is where you need to follow." Friends, today, so often, especially in our American mindset, we have this tendency to think that we know better than Jesus on how we need to do life. And Jesus says, "Get behind me. Get in line. Reorient our life in line with following Jesus." How are you doing on that? What areas of your life do you need to reorient so that you're following Jesus, not trying to get ahead of him, not rebuking him, but you're behind him. You're trusting him. Jesus, you're leading me, and I'm following. So the first thing we learn in this encounter for us as followers of Jesus, we need to reorient our living in line with following. And then the second is we need to reorient our thinking in line with God's plan. Now, the second part, after he said, "Get behind me, Satan," he said, "For you are mindful, your head is stuck, not on the things of God," not his plan. Your mind, your head is stuck on the stuff of humanity. Peter's thoughts, like ours, can be informed more by our human yearning than the will of God or the plan of God. And Jesus was calling Peter to get his thoughts in line with the things of God, the plan of God, rather than the things of human longing. And Jesus calls you and me, and so often our yearning can be the very thing that we think is leading us, or that we look to lead it. It's our yearning. It's what I want. It's what my heart desires. And so I'm going to follow that. But Jesus says, you're mindful of not of the things of God, but the things of men. Your yearning is defining your following, and it shouldn't be that way as a follower of Jesus. God's plan must always define our following. We need to reorient the way we think so that we are in line with God's plan and following Jesus according to God's plan. When we reorient our living to following and reorient our thinking according to God's plan, then we will take steps forward in the joy, the peace, the hope, the courage, even if that following leads us, as we'll see, through the path of suffering. See, next week we're going to hear Jesus give us clear definition of what it means to follow on Sunday. Mark 8:34 through 38, famously, Jesus said, "If you desire to follow me, you need to take up your cross daily and follow after me." You want to come after me? You want to get in line with God's plan? Then you need to wrap your head around the fact that following me means taking up a cross, suffering, losing your life for my sake in the gospel. Friends, that's a tall order, and it's something that can be challenging for every follower of Jesus. But in order for us to follow Jesus on his mission, we must every day reorient our thinking into following, not leading Jesus, following Jesus. And we need to reorient our thinking so it's our thinking's in line with God's plan. Now, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that you may abound in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. God bless y'all. See y'all Sunday.